their fight against Muammar Gaddafi. They want a no-fly zone and targeted airstrikes on the leader. As Patty Culhane reports from Washington, D.C., there's going to be no quick response to their request.
As the constant gun battles rage, the back and forth for control of a country, and Libyans die in numbers not yet known, the U.S. president sends a message.
We stand for democracy, we stand for an observance of human rights, and that we send a very clear message to the Libyan people that we will stand with them.
But the bigger question for these fighters is how will the U.S. stand with them and when?
I wouldn't characterize the likelihood of further options being pursued as greater now, but we have said from the beginning that those options were on the table, and none of them have been removed from the table.
There's been a lot of talk about this so-called table, so let's take a look at what is supposedly on it. One option, instituting a no-fly zone. That's what the U.S. Senate is pushing for, but the U.S. military has pushed back, saying it would be complicated and would require military strikes. Another option being talked about by some politicians, giving weapons to the rebels.
It would be premature to send a bunch of weapons to a post office box in eastern Libya. We need to not get ahead of ourselves in terms of the options we're pursuing.
The administration says it wants to know more about the rebels first and adds sending weapons is not currently allowed under the existing UN sanctions. The other option, humanitarian assistance. This seems to be where the Obama administration is putting much of its focus, agreeing to give another $15 million to aid groups Monday. Some experts predict that will be the extent of what the U.S. will be willing to do.
Lean much more toward humanitarian assistance, like helping the refugees, for example, providing food, rather than actually using military force to attack Gaddafi.
The U.S. president can hear the cries for help from the battlefields, feel the push from the politicians, even in his own party, but in the end, only he can answer the question, what is the U.S. willing to do? Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Richard Falk is a professor of international law emeritus at Princeton University and the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories. He joins us now via broadband from Santa Barbara in California. Thanks a lot for joining us, Professor Falk. We've spoken to many rebels. We've spoken to National Council members. Many of them have called for the imposition of a no-fly zone. Some have said, one in particular last night told me, that he wants surgical strikes on Gaddafi strongholds. And we've also got the Gulf Arab states saying that they want a no-fly zone. It seems to be a no-brainer that there needs to be some sort of international military intervention, doesn't it?
Well, I think it's a more complicated question because one does have a legal framework for when force can be legitimately used. And that framework really derives from the UN Charter and the operations of the UN, particularly the Security Council. Here we have a situation where any use of military force by the international community would be in a non-defensive mode. It's not being used as part of the right of self-defense. And therefore, if one takes international law seriously, as I believe it should be, then one would need a Security Council authorization, which is unlikely to be forthcoming. So one has this international law obstacle that hasn't been really discussed at all, perhaps because it is an obstacle. And one also has the practice of intervention in this region, which has been consistently a failure and has actually intensified the suffering of the people it was designed to help.
Granted that intervention in the region historically has by and large been negative, should we not be looking at this on a case-by-case basis? Why do we have to be, by default, suspicious of the motives of whether it's the United States or NATO or any other global power?
I think we have to be suspicious because of the selective nature of these supposedly humanitarian responses. There's a very different attitude that's already been exhibited toward the uprisings in Bahrain and elsewhere in the region. The two governments for which intervention is being proposed are Iran and Libya, both of whom have regimes that are hostile to European and Western interests. Sub-Saharan African conflicts have posed much more serious humanitarian catastrophes without generating any impulse toward intervention. So I think it is appropriate to be suspicious, while agreeing with you that a case-by-case approach is mandatory, because each situation does present a mixture of moral, political, and legal considerations.
With respect, I just want to address the fact that some might think that you have an axe to grind with the United Nations, given the events of January, where Ban Ki-moon called what he said your comments on 9/11 to be offensive, and the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, calling for you to be fired. How would you address those who say you have an axe to grind, so you're naturally going to be suspicious of anything related to the UN with regards to Libya?
Well, actually, the position I'm articulating is quite the opposite. I'm suggesting that without the UN authorization, I find the proposal to use force legally and politically dubious. I'm really saying that one should at least exhaust the issue of not circumventing the UN and presenting at least some rationale for circumventing it, if that is the supposed moral and political imperative in this situation.
Richard Falk, great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for talking to us via broadband. Now moving on to Tunisia, where the Prime Minister, the interim Prime Minister, has unveiled his new cabinet and disbanded the country's feared and hated secret police. It's the third caretaker government since the overthrow of Zain al-Abidine bin Ali in January. Nazneen Mushiri has more from Tunis.
It was billed as a new beginning, but the interim Prime Minister Beji Caid Sebsi admitted the key positions in government will remain the same. The difference now, a promise that not one member of the cabinet will stand in the next election, and security will be a priority.
We wanted it to be a caretaker government, but more importantly, a government which saves the country from this predicament.
One of the first moves of this new government, the dismantling of the so-called political police, filmed here by AlJazeera. A force which harassed and spied on Tunisians for so many years. The Ministry of Interior announcement came on its Facebook page. It just shows you how times have changed in Tunisia. This once